Okay, thank you for your patience and for joining us today. I am Luanda Arai, and I work with the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs at the City of Seattle, and I use she and her pronouns. So if you're here to hear more about the Immigrant Safety and Access Network request for proposals, you are in the right place. I will give you a brief overview of what we'll cover today. We'll do a little bit of logistics and housekeeping, and then I will review each of the documents that is posted regarding the request for proposal. So the overall actual request, the guidelines, the cover sheet and application, and the budget worksheet. And we should have more than enough time for questions and answers. As far as our starting, welcome again. Thank you for being here. I know we had some technical difficulties before, so I'm happy to provide additional information as we go through. You are welcome to put your name, pronouns, and organization in the chat to introduce yourself. So it looks like we have a small group today, so I think we'll have lots of time for questions. Like I said, you're welcome to use the chat to submit questions at any time that I'm presenting. And then after the session, we have an email address where you can send questions. There's also a phone number. So we'll be accepting questions until March 1st. That's next Wednesday. So for closed captioning, I do have it on in Spanish for recording purposes. So you might be able to see that at the bottom of your screen. You can also select your own closed captioning language. And so if you go to the bottom right of your WebEx window, there's a little thought bubble with the CC, and if you click that up arrow, it will give you some languages, not an extensive list. If you require additional interpretation or translation, please also reach out to us, and we are more than happy to do a one-on-one session with an interpreter if that would be helpful. And so, as I said, while I'm presenting, easiest way to put in questions through the chat. You can also raise your hand, or I'll unmute everyone at the end, and you can ask your questions there. This is the email address. It's also on the website where you can send your questions, and the phone number. We will have this recording posted on the website, hopefully today still, but at the latest on Monday. And then we'll continue collecting questions until March 1st, as I mentioned. We will have a write-up of all the questions posed, both at this session, the previous session, and anything else that comes through. We'll have all those questions posted to the website by Friday, March 3rd. And as I said, interpretation and translation requests, we are more than happy to accommodate those as well. You can use the same contact information. So I will actually exit out of this, pardon my navigation here, but we're gonna start looking at the request for proposal guideline document. So this it is posted on the website, as I mentioned, and I'm just gonna go through it and sort of talk through the different sections just to reinforce what's already on the page. I'm not going to read it all out to you, don't worry. This first section gives us a little bit of background on where the Immigrant Safety and Access Network came from. We're abbreviating it to ISAN. As you can see here, we have about $200,000 to award, and applications are due Thursday, March 9th. We expect, we are not sure how many applications we will receive, but we anticipate that we'll likely make about 4 awards. And I'll get into more detail about that shortly. The overarching goals, I think, are important to note. So the we understand that community is already doing a lot of work to work with immigrant and refugee families who experience violence. And we know that, as is often the case, immigrant and refugee communities have to be resilient and figure out ways to navigate the systems in this country. And so we are leaving the details of the program up to each applicant to define, but it's critical that they align with these overarching goals. And so I'll speak more to that as well as we go through. And then a little bit more technical information about the awards. So the City of Seattle will make 12-month contracts and up to $58,000 and award up to $58,000 per project. We work on a reimbursement basis, and so typically we will do quarterly invoicing and reimbursement. We at OIRA have really tried to make this process relatively streamlined, and we don't expect that you'll need to provide a ton of documentation with those quarterly invoices, but the funding will be on a reimbursement basis. So that's important to note. We also say here that the projects must serve Seattle and King County residents. That doesn't mean that your organization needs to be located within Seattle or King County. Your organization's address might be outside of this area, but all the services provided need to be within the bounds of King County. And so, we give some background on how we got to this point, defining sort of what we think about when we say community violence. We're usually talking about interpersonal violence that happens between people within community. So not typically talking about property crime or things like that. We've also done some community listening sessions and looked at different departments who have also done listening sessions, like the Seattle Police Department and the Department of Neighborhoods. And we've also taken that into consideration. So that first part gives you a little bit of that background. I would encourage all applicants to really take a close look at this section of what will success look like. As I mentioned, we believe that community has expertise around these problems. We are not interested in funding or dictating a very cookie cutter approach. There is not a program model that we are saying you must follow to apply for these funds. But there are certain things that will make your application more likely to be funded. So we do want to see that that you are able to articulate the community's strengths and define your community. I understand that that word has a lot of different meanings depending on who you are and the context that we're talking about. And so we want you to be as specific as possible. And we'd like to be able to understand about those strengths that are already in community, both in terms of the strengths of the providers in your community and also of the community members themselves. And so we want to be able to build on those strengths. We understand that there's obviously service gaps and inequities, but we want to approach this from a strengths-based perspective. And so we'd like to see that you're able to do that as well. There are some key phrases that you might see throughout this section. Highly competitive applications will. So here, it says clearly define specific neighborhoods or geographic areas. But that's essentially us giving you insight into what we're looking for in your applications. We want to see that you understand the specific neighborhoods or areas that you're working in, and like I said, those community strengths. We also want to see that the services will be delivered and overseen by people who are representative of the communities that your project is serving. So please include that as well. And again, just being specific is really helpful for the reviewers. And so, you know, we also talk about collaboration in this section. We understand that communities, and I see the question here, yes, we are recording this, and so that will be posted on the website. We understand that community organizations partner with each other all the time, and sometimes that's really formal and sometimes it's not. We also know that this issue of community violence is very complex, and so we'd love to hear about how you are collaborating and what does that actually look like. Do you have regular meetings? Do you reimburse each other? How do you do referrals? So if those are already existing, we want to hear about them. And if they're not, we want to hear about how you will do that. And it's not a requirement that your partnerships are already in place, but we just want to, again, hear the specifics of how that actually operates. And in that, you know, we know that sometimes some organizations are bigger or have more funding, and so we want to understand those nuances as well. It's important that we, as a funder, support smaller organizations to sort of build their own capacity as well. And oftentimes we hear about larger organizations leaning on smaller organizations without compensation or without thoughtful assigning of duties. And so we want to understand what are some of those dynamics. And so, like I said, just to recap, this section of what will success look like should really give you some insight into what we're looking for in your application in terms of the general philosophy and approach that we're taking. And so then in this application information, I'll get a little bit more specific. And so in terms of the actual service activities we expect to see, we expect to fund, it really is a fairly broad scope in terms of what you might be providing. It does not mean that we think projects should include all of these services. We actually don't expect that a project would include all of these services, especially without partners. But these are some of the examples of the types of programming that we expect to fund. So certainly prevention is a big issue. We know that immigrant and refugee youth and young adults are often experiencing barriers to accessing some of this violence prevention programming that's already in community. So we want to see that things are adapted and the outreach is done to engage communities that have historically been faced barriers to accessing violence prevention programming. We know that dealing with criminal legal systems, from law enforcement to courts, can be incredibly cumbersome, confusing, and so we understand that there are already folks out there doing some systems navigation, so helping folks understand processes, understand paperwork, things like that. We certainly expect that that is a particular need that immigrants and refugees have, and so that's what we mean when we say criminal legal systems navigation. Victim support services can include things like counseling. It can include a connection to grief services. It can include a whole host of services related to a person who was a victim of a crime. And their families, when we know that, because we know that that effect can have a broader reach in our communities. And so we expect that some of the projects will include these services. Critical incident response is really when, in the immediate aftermath of violence occurring. So when there's a shooting or some other type of violence, what happens immediately afterwards in terms of communications and logistics. We know that there are nonprofits already doing some of this work. And we know that organizations that are part of that response are often underfunded. And so that's part of this incident. That's part of what we mean with critical incident response. Court and hospital accompaniment, again, it's about navigation. We know that if you have a loved one who's been a victim of violence in the hospital, and accessing information, being able to visit, doing all of that sometimes requires extra support. Same thing with appearing in court. And so, again, those are eligible activities. Restorative justice practices. We also understand that interactions with the criminal legal system feel like violence to many of our community members, and we are interested in alternatives to detention, alternatives to incarceration, and punitive practices. So when we talk about restorative justice, it's about those alternatives that are community-based, that are based on healing and true rehabilitation as opposed to punishment. And that doesn't mean that your organization has to provide these services, but again, it might look like navigation, it might look like advocacy for folks who are trying to deal with these issues. Crime victim compensation services, I'll talk a little bit more when we look at the budget worksheet, but we know that there are unmet needs for immigrant refugee communities when there is violence that occurs. So something like transporting a body from the morgue to a funeral home might be a type of compensation that would be effective. And there are obviously other expenses as well. And again, I'll talk more about the specifics of that when we look at the budget worksheet. Similarly with restitution support, we know that getting restitution after a violent crime happens, folks sometimes, because they're dealing with grief and trauma, that support is needed to navigate those things. And so then when we talk about eligible project participants, so the folks that your organization would serve, we are focusing on youth and young adults who come from immigrant and refugee communities. And so the term youth and young adults is defined as children aged 18 to 17 years old and adults aged 18 to 24. That's, a generally accepted definition across many different sectors. There's some science around brain development, and that's not exact, but that's our primary focus. Is those young people under 25, whether they were born outside of the United States or born in this country, but have at least one parent that was born outside of the States. And then we also know, like I said earlier, that when violence happens to young people or among young people, that there is a ripple effect to their families. And so we define the family members here. Basically, we're looking at people who live in the same household as the young person for the most part, but obviously if it's, a 23-year-old that lives by themselves, there might be folks who do not live in the same household, but would certainly qualify as family members within this definition. And so in terms of who can apply for these funds, we will only be able to contract with organizations that are nonprofits. So they have the 501c3 designation from the IRS. We know that some smaller organizations operate with a fiscal sponsor, and so that fiscal sponsor needs to be a 501c3 entity if your organization is not. And as I said at the beginning, we are required to, all services are required to be delivered within the city of Seattle or King County, or both. And so even if you're, like I said, if your organization is not within King County, you can still apply as long as the services are delivered to people who live in this area. And so, you know, we have some other regulatory language there about what you're not allowed to require of participants. And then I'll talk in more depth here about the expectations for funded projects. So we, with our population focused of immigrant and refugee youth and their families, we expect that any project that is awarded will be conducting outreach and providing services to people who speak languages other than English or prefer to speak languages other than English. And so what we're doing is the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs has a fairly robust language access program. And we have set aside funding to be able to centralize the interpretation and translation needs of the organizations that are awarded this funding, which means that if you're developing a flyer or website content or training materials, whatever it may be that you need translated, you would submit them to us. We use our language access program that partners with community-based local translators, and we would translate those materials and return them to you. That does mean that, we'll have to be thoughtful about timing and how long and planning around that, but it also means that you do not have to include language access expenses in your budget. We will be able to facilitate that for the projects that are funded. Similarly with interpretation, we don't have staff interpreters on our staff, but we have connections with interpreter agencies that we trust and we know do a really good job. So again, we can facilitate that, and the funding, the billing would go through our office. So that's one less administrative thing that the awarded projects would need to worry about. I also understand that there are many organizations that have deep knowledge of the languages of the folks that they serve, and maybe that's not quite a need. I would encourage that when it's written materials to still go through OIRA, just because we're working with, very professionalized interpretation folks who are native speakers. We do a community review. It's quite a thorough process, and we found that makes the communications really clear. I also know from my own experience, English is not my first language, and I was often called on to interpret for people, and I'm not trained as an interpreter. I have not gotten any sort of certifications, and that's okay. And sometimes that's all we have. But we want to set a standard of really valuing those services, and so if we can facilitate that, we're happy to do it. And then we can talk a little bit more about that in the project budget worksheet as well. So in terms of other expectations, at this point, this funding is one time. We are sort of approaching it as a pilot. So part of what we want to do is prove that this funding should continue and increase. So we are going to be asking for relatively detailed data. So, we want to see hard numbers, including demographics, but we also want to hear the stories. We want to understand sort of the qualitative, the more personal information that we're learning about people's experiences. And so those we'll have a report template that will be included as part of the contract, and those will be submitted quarterly. Along with invoicing. And then I will be the the program facilitator of these grants, and so I will be organizing regular learning calls. So even though the projects might all look different depending on what we fund, we know that there's really a lot of benefit to talking to other organizations, understanding how maybe one project can fill a gap for another project, or there can be some mutual benefit in referrals. So we'll bring in speakers to help, spreading important information around these issues. So we have contacts with the Seattle Police Department, for example, that can come and provide information about how to report a bias crime, or how to understand an investigative process when there's been a shooting, or something like that. So we are really invested in making this a learning environment among those organizations that are funded, so that we can make the case to both leaders at the city and at King County that they should continue to invest. And then I'll just also mention that we know that as institutions, many of these failings are our fault. And so part of what we want to use this learning to do is to make those changes from the top down, right? So ensure that, for example, Seattle Police Department is providing better language access to their processes, distributing information in a way that reaches communities that it's not currently reaching. So just some examples of the importance of learning as part of this process. And so then the submission instructions, we just want things to be submitted by email to this email address, OIRA@seattle.gov. And I'm sorry, this has the wrong date on it. This should be Thursday, March 9th. And it is correct down here. Thursday, March 9th is when applications are due at 5 p.m. And they should be in a non-editable format. We would prefer PDF, but if there's some other format, you can certainly do that. And then I'll skip over that part. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not seeing the section I thought was down here. What? That's okay. There is an appeals process, and again, all of this is online. So again, like I said, we will have questions submitted until March 1st, and then we'll post the Q&A documents by March 3rd. So this is the overview of the process. Oh, here it is. This is what I was looking for. Apologies. So we want to see, your application with the cover page, a narrative, and the budget worksheets, and then any supplemental materials. And I know why I can't find the section. It's because it's in the next document that I'm going to cover. So let's go there. I do see your question here about, do we have to use partnerships? That's not a requirement. In our experience, we know that oftentimes, because these are complex issues, that partnerships are beneficial to any given project. Sometimes I think it's natural for smaller organizations to sort of take for granted that they're partnering all the time because of their size or the way that they do their work. And so we just want to be able to understand, how do you interact with community, but it's by no means a requirement. And so this is the, application sheet itself, the actual questions that we're asking. So the cover sheet is where we want to capture a snapshot of your project, right? So there's, what's your agency's name? If there are other project partners, like I said, it's not required. Do you have a title for your project? Again, we want to understand the geographic community. So where in King County or Seattle are you providing services? These particular services. It's possible that you're providing services all over King County, but we want to understand, for this particular project, what is the focus? And maybe there isn't one, but then we'd like to hear about why. And then obviously how much you're requesting, a really brief summary of what the project will do, a primary contact person. So this is the person that we will be most in contact with. We do require that all of the partner organizations sign the cover sheet. So there's 2 sections here. If there are more than 2 partners, you're welcome to submit a second cover sheet. Those sheets do not count for your maximum 5 pages. Cover sheet is completely separate. So let's get into those 5 pages. So the application narrative, these are the questions we're interested in learning more about. How you approach this is really up to you. You can certainly take this, it is in a Word format, so you could take it and, insert, I can even do it here. You can, well, now it's tracking changes. Let's undo that. But you can insert, your narrative here and answer the questions directly. You can take this as guidance and write a narrative that does not explicitly include these questions. In general, the reviewers will be looking to see that you have answered these questions, whether you do it very literally or in a more sort of less formal or less regimented way is up to you. But this is the information that we want to hear about. So you'll notice we don't ask, tell us about the history of your organization. We don't ask, tell us about your staff. And so I encourage you to really focus on these questions and use your page space to answer these questions. If we have other questions, if we want more information, that's on us, right? Like I can look at your website, for example, and learn about the history of your organization. I could probably see your staff. And so really we want to hear about this project with this narrative. And so the opportunity is sort of like, explain to us what's happening. What is the community you're serving? What are their strengths? And what are the goals for the project, right? And like I said, we have our own overarching goals that we want to see. And so this is your guidance here about how your goals should contribute to that, right? So how do your goals help decrease the rate of violence happening among immigrant and youth and young adults? How does your project help reduce the harm that immigrant and refugee youth and young adults and their families experience? And how can we ensure that the project is providing services that make sense for the people that you're providing services to? So that's sort of the first section. The second section is the more nitty-gritty, detailed portion of your project, right? Like what exactly are you going to be doing with the funding? Is it staffing? Is it training? Is it information sessions? Is it, what is it? How do all these details help you achieve those goals? And so again, like I said, these are what our reviewers will be looking for when we're reviewing applications, is the answers to these questions. This is the section I was looking for before, the supplemental material. So we'll talk about the application budget. There's a budget worksheet that I'll pull up and we'll go over, but skipping over that for now. The supplemental materials are, we need to see an IRS determination letter. And so whether that's for your organization or your fiscal sponsor. And then if you, like I said, if you have existing agreements or documentations of partnership, we would love to see that. It's not a requirement. We don't expect that you'll be going out tomorrow and asking people to start a partnership and writing a memorandum of understanding. And we don't want you to do that extra work, but we understand that you may have already done that work at some point. And so we'd love to know about it. In the previous section, we did have a person ask about letters of support. That's certainly welcome. Again, it's not a requirement. We also want to be considerate of our reviewers' time. So, I certainly wouldn't expect anyone to submit 10 letters of support. Maybe limit it to 1 or 2, maybe 3. Just so we can, as long as it helps us understand how the project is going to operate, and who has skin in the game, who is invested in this project. And you might ask a partner for a letter of support, but again, it is not a requirement by any means. And so just a quick checklist, fairly straightforward. This cover sheet, and if you need more because of signatures, you're welcome to do that. This is, I see the question about the template format. Yes, the cover sheet is limited, so you'll put in your answers in these gray boxes, and obviously they'll expand to fit your answer. So we certainly need a cover sheet with those signatures, up to 5 pages that answers these questions of the narrative, and the budget worksheet, which the workbook that I'll go over in a second. Ideally, they would all be in one PDF that we can look at as a single document, and that it's non-editable. And if you need technical assistance around doing that, please feel free to reach out. And then again, that IRS determination letter for 501c3 organizations. And then again, anything that's already existing that helps us learn about your partnerships, if they are already there. So next we'll go to the budget worksheet. And so I'm going to make this a tiny bit smaller, or maybe bigger, so that you can see. There we go. So the first tab, or the first worksheet in this workbook, I am not an Excel person, and you may be able to tell, is just the instructions, right? So we know that maybe you already are doing some of this program, you already have funding for some of this work. We're not interested in that at this point. In this worksheet, we only want to know what you will be using our funds for. So the ISAN ISAN funded project expenses. Again, there's a reminder there that the contracts are on a reimbursement basis. And then we talk a little bit about what each column does in the following worksheets. But I want to spend the bulk of our time here on the allowable expenses. So we obviously personnel, we understand that there might be staffing costs associated. We want to know what those are. Any benefits related to that personnel. We know that delivering services might include travel, and we are, an allowable expense is to reimburse for that type of travel. We do have this little note here about within federal limits, and at the bottom here of the worksheet, there is a link that will take you to an explanation of those federal limits for travel. We know that you may need some supplies, printing, copying, postage, those types of supplies that you might need. Any occupancy costs that are tracked as a direct project expense. So maybe the way you do your accounting is that each project or program has a formula that you type in to figure out how much of the agency occupancy costs is that program paying for. Not everyone does it that way. That's totally fine. If you do, we'd love to see those spelled out. If there's some training requirement, including travel for training, again, that's allowable. This direct victim assistance is sort of a more complex one. So we know, like I mentioned, transporting a body or providing some kind of crime victim services. We do allow for that type of spending. We know that these initial contracts will be relatively small, so I'm not sure how many projects will prioritize this, but we will allow for it. And it does have to be in accordance with the Washington State Department of Labor and Industries Crime Victim Benefits. And again, there is a link to that website here that I will, there we go. Oh, sorry, it's not letting me open it, but I will open it. Oh, here we go. It gives you an overview of who can file and what is covered. So we just want any compensation services that you provide with our funding to be in line with the state's program. And so this just essentially gives us, we know that the state has already vetted this process in terms of legality and processes, so we want to piggyback on that and not reinvent the wheel. So this is some of the examples of what would be paid for. And you know, obviously these maximums are beyond the reach of beyond the scope of our grant, but it does say, you know, it has some limits as well in terms of property crime and things like that. So like I said, that is linked there for your reference. And then indirect costs are, you know, all the other things that you might be paying for as an organization that you might assign to this project. It might be some of those occupancy costs if that's how you do your accounting, but it might not be. And then the last tab is your narrative. And I'm sorry, I'm just having a hard time navigating on my screen here. So if we go to the second tab, the second worksheet, you'll see that it's a fairly loose template. You know, we just want you to be able to fill this. We wanted to give you as much flexibility as possible, so you can fill in these lines, you can add in more rows, you can add explanatory notes about the expenses if you'd like, and the different amounts. We do have a formula here that will calculate the indirect costs, and so, yeah, you can you'd put in the indirect costs here, and this will automatically calculate that percentage of your indirect costs. Just because we want to understand that the city of Seattle typically allows for about 10 to 15% in indirect costs with these types of contracts. We're not setting a hard limit. We understand that there may be some capacity building happening, so we do certainly are going to look closely at this, and we may have questions about it, but we're not doing a very rigid cap. And so, and I'm sorry again, working on a small screen. Let me go to the last tab. These are just questions to sort of help us understand some of your thinking around the budget and you know, the financial health of the organization. And then there's an open spot for you to put in other comments if you wish to. So if we go back to, I think, oh, that covers everything. And we can move to, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, so feel free to let me go back through the chat. Let's see. Yes, we are recording. You don't have to, partnerships are not required. Yeah, so that's a great question about do partnerships have to be paid? Certainly not. We also know that, you know, there's a lot of just mutually beneficial partnership that happens. What we are on the lookout for, I should say, is that smaller organizations aren't being asked to do work in an unfair way. And, you know, I think most of the folks who have been on our calls are already small organizations, so maybe this doesn't apply, but I'm thinking, you know, I've certainly seen projects where a big organization, and I'm not going to say I'm not going to name any names, but a big mainstream organization will say, oh yeah, no, we can do this outreach to this other, this marginalized community, and they don't actually pay anyone to do that outreach. They just expect the smaller, culturally specific organizations to do that work without support. And so that's what we're trying to protect against. But certainly we understand that there are less formal, mutually beneficial partnerships that work well among providers. So again, just encourage you to be specific about what that looks like. Then yes, the cover page is in a template format, so that's the only section. The questions are just a Word document. So yes, I think we have, like I said, we have about 40 minutes still of the scheduled time. I'm happy to, you're welcome to unmute yourself, turn on your camera, or type in the chat if there are other questions. I'm more than happy to answer them.
Hello.
Hi.
There's only 2 of us on here
Right.
besides you. Is this going to be recorded, or are you going to do another one?
We did one on the 14th, and that we had about 30 people on that one, but we had some real technical difficulties where we weren't able to record it. And so this is an opportunity for us to record, and hopefully it looks like it's recording just fine this time. So we'll post this one, but all the questions that were asked in the first session, I were captured. And so those will be included in the Q&A documents that we post.
Okay.
And I'm happy to sort of talk a little bit about those if that's helpful. We had a question about what if an organization already has professional interpreters or translators that they work with. I think that's a conversation that we'd want to have on a case-by-case basis. We certainly wouldn't want to burden a particular project with extra expenses that other projects wouldn't be budgeting for. So, we'd have to figure out how to navigate that on a little bit more of an individual basis, but it doesn't, we thought it would just be easier to centralize that language access piece since we know we have a solid program that we can leverage. So that was one of the questions. We had questions about service in King County and Seattle. I know that's always an issue, right? Because people are being displaced, people move around. The example I gave is, so I'm an immigrant myself. I was born and raised in Brazil, and I know that the Brazilian community in our area are mostly on the east side, so like Bothell, Kirkland, Redmond. And so if I'm defining the community my project is targeting, I might say it's the Brazilian community. And so I'd want to be really explicit about what that means, right? Where do they live? What are the ages? What are some of the issues that I'm hearing about happening in terms of community violence? And then I would be limited in my project in serving only those who reside within King County. And so the folks who maybe reside in Bothell, for example, unfortunately, that's Snohomish County. And so that would be we would certainly hope that any learning that happens within the project within King County, it translates or is expanded to other areas, but our funding is restricted to Seattle and King County. That was another, I think, important and broadly applicable question. And another question we had was around paying for counseling or legal services. And so with these types of contracts, we are limited to working with nonprofit entities, meaning that certainly we know that part of victim support services and criminal legal navigation includes lawyers and counselors. And so we would expect that any of our funding that's used for that would be directed towards nonprofit legal services and nonprofit counseling or mental health support or what have you. It is just a little bit of bureaucracy, to be totally honest, around to make it easier for our contracts to be not too cumbersome. Oh, I see the question about using it for expungements. That's a really good question, and I want to give that some more thought and vetting. So I will definitely include that in our Q&A document, and we'll let you know when that's posted. It'll be posted at the latest on March 3rd, but it will have, that will be the final version. Earlier next week, we'll have a first pass at those questions, and I'll include a more detailed answer for that question. Thank you. And so I think that those are the main questions from the previous session that I think are relevant. I'm happy to stay on and answer other questions as they come up. And again, you are always welcome to call or email with additional questions as you think of them.
You mentioned people being displaced.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm kind of thinking about maybe domestic violence.
Sure.
So would this funding be able to cover getting a family out of their present housing to a better, safer housing situation?
You know, that's a really good question, and I think I don't have a clean answer for that. I think, you know, in terms of the direct victim support, so it might be, you know, transportation or something like that. That makes sense to me. That is a clear allowable expense. In terms of, you know, paying for housing, especially if it's a for-profit landlord, that would not be an allowable expense. But in terms of sort of like what it might take, you know, the supportive services that might be necessary to help the family move make more sense to me. Again, I think that's a really important question to give you a really thoughtful response on. So in our write-up, I will be sure to include clearer guidance around that.
And also, could the funding be used for like preventative measures for youth to stay out of trouble?
Absolutely. So violence prevention is certainly something we're interested in. And we know that there's a lot of really good work already happening in community. What we've also heard is that it's not always accessible for immigrant refugee youth or their parents or their guardians, for example. So programming might not be offered in other languages, or outreach might not be done in other languages. And so that's a really great use of this funding, is how do you take existing programs that are working well and make them more equitably accessible to those folks who speak languages other than English.
And you did mention training.
Yeah,
So would that be like staff training?
exactly. So we know that, you know, maybe you need to hire staff, or you already have staff, but you're adding some new function to their work, and they might require some training around engaging with youth or engaging with law enforcement or whatever it might be. The training that's related to the programming is an allowable expense.
But okay, so I'm looking at the education system. If there were students that were still in high school and they had experienced some justice involvement of some sort, and if there was I guess that was some of the same thing, violence prevention.
Yeah, yeah. Whether a young person is enrolled in school or not, it does not matter to us. Obviously, we think that school is a good thing, but that's not really a focus of this funding. So, yeah, if it is school based, that's totally fine as well. We understand that schools are often a good partner, a good way to connect with young people and their families, and so we'd love to learn more about that. And that's certainly an allowable thing.
And are you going to distribute this recording?
Yeah, so we will clean it up. I'm sure there's some dead time at the beginning that we'll need to cut out, make sure that the sound is good, and then we will post it to our website possibly this afternoon, maybe not until Monday.
Including the slide deck?
That's right.
Great.
I appreciate your questions and your time. I think this is really helpful for us because, we can't think of everything. And so this really helps us. It brings up things that we haven't thought of that we can provide more guidance around through the Q&A document. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. And you have a wonderful weekend.
My pleasure. You too.
Bye.
Take care.